When it comes to Zelda games, I am always trying to analyze them from a new perspective. So much has already been said about these prolific games that I often have to look inward and ask myself what they represent to me. It's hard work, but it's also great fun, and I love doing it. As it happens, there actually is a Zelda game that revolves around seeing things from different angles. While A Link Between Worlds' merging mechanic and its use of three-dimensional depth are excellent examples, The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap predates it by nearly a decade. With its items, quests, story, and central mechanic, it is all about seeing things differently, and appreciating things from many different angles, both metaphorically and literally. The Minish Cap was the last Zelda game to be developed by Capcom, but it represented the culmination of their work on the series. Their previous mainline entries, Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages, both managed to craft worlds that players could explore through the differing perspectives of their namesakes, such as summer, autumn, and winter in the former, or past and present in the latter. The Minish Cap simplifies this to just 2 modes, with both forms of exploration being visible at all times. If you see an area you'd like to explore as Little Link, you find a way to shrink down and see where it leads. This concept both directly and indirectly drives every aspect of the game. Unfortunately, it went largely unappreciated by the vast majority of Zelda fans. Much like the Oracle games, I think my first exposure to the Minish Cap was through the manga created by Akira Himekawa. While the Oracle games sold about 4 million copies despite releasing late in the Game Boy Color's life, the Minish Cap sold only about 1.7 million. Not counting spin-offs or multiplayer games, this makes it one of the weakest selling games in the entire series. Perhaps this could have been due to the reuse of Wind Waker's cartoonish art style, which a lot of people were still sour on. Perhaps it was the competition between the Nintendo DS and the PSP that was taking place at the time, which largely drowned out any discussion of the Game Boy Advance. In spite of all this, however, the game manages to use its unique position in the series to the fullest, and replaying it allowed me to reflect on how we can have an impact on the world around us. Today, I wanted to take a look at an often overlooked, bite-sized Zelda game with big ideas. I wanted to examine both its place in the Zelda series, and as a reflection of what we put out into the world. Sometimes, the littlest things can leave a big impact. I'm Liam Triforce, and this is a video about The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap. But first, a quick thank you to this video's sponsor, Brilliant. I want to make a video game. I always have, and to gain a deeper understanding of programming, I want to learn computer science. Brilliant makes learning computer science, as well as many other facets of math and science, intuitive and digestible for people of all skill levels. It represents the vital concepts of its courses through appealing, minimalistic visuals and hands-on, interactive lessons. Like this instance in which you apply repetition to minimize the number of commands for this drone. As it continues to build on concepts, the problems are consistently presented in unique ways with their own theming. There are dozens of courses to choose from beyond computer science though, covering algebra, calculus, logic, data, probability, and more, with new content every month. I plan on using Brilliant to further my understanding of computer science, and if you'd like to check it out for yourself, the first 200 people to sign up using the link in the description will get 20% off an annual premium subscription to Brilliant. The core concept of the Minish Cap is being able to shrink down to the size of a gnat, and the layered puzzle solving that this can enable. The concept of shrinking down to solve puzzles is actually borrowed from The Legend of Zelda: Four Swords. I originally wanted to cover this game before the Minish Cap, but unfortunately I haven't been able to make it happen just yet. Along with being able to shrink, a couple of items, area designs, and boss concepts have been borrowed from that game, like Rock's cape and the final fight with Vaati and the use of multiple links to defeat him. Of course, those ideas were previously confined to a game that was designed for cooperative level-by-level progression, and they had yet to reach their fullest potential. The Minish Cap gives these concepts new life thanks to how well it delivers on its main focus on shrinking to solve puzzles. It is an extension of what the Oracle games had accomplished, except this time the possibilities for exploration in each mode can always be observed. A small dirt path, a tiny hole, a lily pad, things that seem teensy as normal Link can open new paths and reveal new solutions once you find a pedestal to shrink down, like a tree trunk or a stone. These two gameplay elements are always working in tandem to create some awesome scenarios across the game. But the new perspectives aren't just presented through this single mechanic. The game's items, dungeons, puzzles, and quests all give you new things to consider as you walk through new areas and revisit old ones. A lot of the Minish Cap's design philosophy spawned from Hidemaro Fujibayashi's fondness for the original Legend of Zelda. Like the Oracle games, the Minish Cap was directed by him, and he let his admiration for the original game bleed into this one. I mean, the Royal Valley in this game contains references to the original Legend of Zelda, including its own interpretation of the Lost Woods, and a cool mini-dungeon that uses music from the original game. Beyond subtle references though, the original game was all about viewing the game world differently with each item you'd obtain. Bombs could be used to blow holes in walls and find caves, candles could be used to burn bushes and find secret entrances, docks on the shoreline could hint toward a dungeon entrance once you have the raft, and so on. Even environmental puzzles like the Lost Woods, the looping staircase in the mountains, and the magical sword in the graveyard are all about using your knowledge of the game to see things differently. To begin, we'll examine the game's first dungeon, the Deepwood Shrine. While it introduces universal mechanics like pushing and pulling objects, finding switches, fighting enemies to open doors and all that jazz, where it really shines is in its central mechanics. This dungeon tries not to overwhelm the player with the concept of switching between sizes, and instead represents the feeling of being tiny in the art design and dungeon concepts. This giant barrel can rotate if you move back and forth inside of it, linking you up to a few different exits. It is both a charming use of the game's unique perspective, and a method of dictating the flow of the dungeon through a central hub. There's one exit, however, that is obstructed by a cobweb. This is where the Gust Jar comes in. You can think of it as a precursor to the Gust Bellows in Skyward Sword. It clears cobwebs, blows away dust, sucks up mushrooms from across bodies of water, building on a concept utilized throughout the dungeon, and it can even help you defeat certain enemies. It also allows you to link every dungeon concept together once you suck up the cobweb in the barrel. You'll fall through the center and onto a lily pad below. What now? As it turns out, you can push the lily pad across the water by consistently shooting air in the direction opposite from where you wish to travel. This allows you to connect to a room you could only observe previously, and from there, the dungeon is yours. This dungeon is a fantastic introduction to the core ideas that make a Zelda game what it is, and it makes clever artistic use of the game's setting. Even the dungeon boss represents the shift in perspective well. A Choo-Choo that is normally close to Link's height is now towering above him. The next area you'll find yourself in is Mount Krenel. By this point you'll have bombs, and you'll no doubt have blown a few holes in designated spots around Hyrule. Mount Krenel throws you a curveball by having you blast holes in walls that either have vague visual cues or a hint nearby. This harkens back to the original Zelda. That game is famous for having bombable walls with no indication of where you need to place a bomb. Of course, there are hints in the instruction manual and the game itself, but implementing this in a more modern Zelda game for players with modern sensibilities was going to be a challenge. It has been attempted in future 2D and 3D Zeldas, but I believe the Minish Cap was the first game in the series to iterate on them in a meaningful way. Starting with the first hint, there's a sign that says, "Beware crumbling walls, blasting strictly prohibited." Next to it is a fence that heavily hints at there being something behind that wall. Sure enough, there is a cave behind the wall that allows you to progress. Although explicit, this encourages players to look for odd formations and paths that lead to seemingly nowhere across the mountain. Doing so can reward you with stuff like heart pieces. This concept continues into certain dungeons across the Minish Cap. The idea of constructively iterating on something that can seem cryptic to most nowadays made Mount Krenel stand out to me, but there's more to it than just clever design callbacks. Like I've mentioned, the foundation of the Minish Cap is built on seeing things differently, and the Deepwood Shrine and these bombable walls are only the beginning. One of the downsides to being the size of an ant is that you can't always traverse the same terrain you could normally. Shallow puddles become deep oceans, some unruly grass becomes an endless forest, piles of stones become immovable boulders. Just as new opportunities open up to you when you shrink down, new obstructions also present themselves. The Minish Woods briefly touch upon these possibilities with its lily pads and logs, but Mount Krenel is the first area to flesh out both planes of navigation. Essentially, you need to clear a path with the Gust Jar, find a stone that you can use to shrink down, and navigate through the stones to fetch spring water and grow some vines for you to climb. The possibilities for this kind of puzzle solving are further conveyed in Castor Wilds and the Wind Ruins. These regions are a blast to explore. When you first enter, you can use your Pegasus boots to traverse the murky water, and climb vines to cross bridges to different sections of the area. This allows you to piece it together bit by bit, and assess problems that eventually gain solutions later, like these statues. You'll also need 3 kinstone pieces in order to access the Wind Ruins, so the non-linear method of exploration has a purpose beyond just seeking information. You can solve puzzles as they come. You can find an area where you can shrink down after navigating the bridges, platforms, and murky water that segment this region to discover the bow. Maybe you can use those gusts of wind to glide over large bodies of water that you can't swim across. Perhaps you could even clear a path to other sections of the area by moving these statues with an arrow. Once you've gone and found all 3 kinstone pieces, you'll find yourself in the Wind Ruins, which has you navigating as both Big Link and Little Link to restore power to the statues that obstruct your path. The dungeons contain a lot of the Minish Cap's best examples of lateral thinking. The Cave of Flames has 3 key elements to its puzzles: these high-speed minecarts and the track layouts, the ability to shrink within the dungeon in order to reach places you otherwise can't, which becomes crucial as the dungeons get tougher, and these holes that need to be filled with enemies and other things. Then comes the Cane of Pachi, which serves as the catalyst for a lot of the creative angles from which you can approach problems. And all it really does is flip things over. You can flip minecarts over to ride in them, flip platforms over to walk on them, and flip certain enemies or parts of enemies over to attack them. It can also launch Link out of those plentiful holes across the dungeon and overworld. This is where things get interesting. Those holes you've been seeing across the overworld are now gateways to new portions of Hyrule that were previously inaccessible. And now that you know you can flip things over, you may also realize that you can flip those giant pots in Hyrule Town and reveal a new way to shrink yourself down. The point of all this is that the Cane of Pachi is seemingly simplistic in utility, but it has plenty of applications all over the place, and it is one of many ways new perspectives present themselves in the Minish Cap. The next dungeon, the Fortress of Winds, has 3 accessible paths to check out when you first arrive, each leading to a different portion of the dungeon, and eventually linking together in the center when you reveal a key. In between dungeons, you'll also infuse your sword with elements in the Elemental Sanctuary, allowing you to create a clone of yourself for a brief period of time if you charge a spin attack on one of these glowing squares. This means you won't always have to look for a pot to push to an adjacent switch to hold them both down, and sometimes you'll have to navigate carefully through a dungeon so that your clone doesn't disappear. There's also more involved use of shrinking to navigate the dungeon, as you can see here, and there's times where you'll have to fall between each floor like the Tower of Hera from A Link to the Past. The dungeon item once again presents a new way to look at the world around you. Through the fortress, you'll find yourself navigating tunnels filled with walls of dirt. The mole mitts allow you to dig through as much of the dirt as your heart desires, quite literally tearing down the walls crafted by this dungeon to keep it segmented and dictate its progression. There's so much to discover and so many chests to find that you could spend a long while in this dungeon just searching for the treasure on your compass. A precedent for this was established in the Deepwood Shrine in the Cave of Flames. One of my favorite things about the dungeons of Twilight Princess was that each dungeon contained 2 heart pieces, which gave the players the opportunity to experiment further with that new item they'd found and acquaint themselves further with a dungeon's layout. In the Minish Cap, you can observe most of the heart pieces during a general playthrough of the dungeon. All that's left is to figure out how the heck you're supposed to grab them. As your knowledge of an item grows and you understand the layout more, you can eventually put the pieces together. The mole mitts feel like an extension of this. And of course, they have their uses in the overworld as well, allowing you to forge new paths through caves that have their entrances filled. The Temple of Droplets also has some great examples of finding unique angles to approach problems. Do you remember the puzzle in A Link to the Past where you had to shine light through a bombable hole in the floor to reveal a dungeon boss? That is essentially how the Temple of Droplets begins, with you having to open and close the gates on the 2nd floor to let light in, and do some good old sliding block puzzles that Ocarina of Time popularized to grab the keys. Not only is the big key immediately obtainable, the dungeon boss and element are right in front of you as you enter the next portion of the dungeon, albeit frozen. So what's next? While the dungeon revisits concepts from the Deepwood Shrine, you now have the flippers, which allow you to swim from one shore to another. The block puzzles increase in difficulty as you go, and melting the ice becomes a consistent theme until you finally obtain the means to do it yourself with the lantern. There's also a neat little puzzle where you can find a hint that says the way forward is hidden at the bottom of the pot. Rather than looking under every pot in the dungeon, you can spot a formation in the water that takes the shape of a pot, and dive into the center of it for a key. Some of my favorite areas in the game are the Cloud Tops and its accompanying dungeon, the Palace of Winds. After applying what you've learned across the game's various areas, including Castor Wilds with its water traversal and kinstone collecting, and Mount Krenel and its fondness for secret bombable walls, you'll find yourself at the top of Vale Falls and before a giant gust of wind that'll shoot you up into the clouds. The cloud tops have 5 mysterious clouds for you to fuse kinstones with, but you'll first have to locate the mysterious clouds and the hidden kinstone pieces to begin with. You'll have to traverse the clouds by switching between the upper and lower layers, as well as glide from one cloud to another. You can also dig through clouds to find goodies, and you'll have to deal with enemies along the way. The non-linear nature of this area is a grand test of the many ways you're asked to evaluate and memorize your surroundings from multiple angles, and things get even more complex in the Palace of Winds. Aside from the final dungeon, this dungeon is by far the beefiest and most challenging the game has to offer, with many floors to climb, as well as indoor sections with a separate map. You first have to traverse its perilous terrain and fight its many enemies without falling off, which is a daunting task. If you manage to do that, you quickly receive the dungeon item, Roc's Cape. This magnificent item allows you to clear sizable gaps with ease, and it comes into play through most of the dungeon's platforming scenarios. Jumping with the direction of the wind, jumping between platforms and through grates, etc. The indoor sections have you exploring the layout as miniature Link before diving into it as normal Link. After fighting your way through to the halfway point, you'll be tasked with defeating a Darknut on a tight platform. You'll have encountered these beastly enemies before, but never on terrain like this. You can either find ways to cut through its patterns and deal enough damage to kill it, or force it off of the platform and have it follow its death. It's either you or the Darknut. Next comes the indoor portion of the dungeon. As you enter, you'll find yourself in almost complete darkness. You'll need to use the lantern to light your way and discover the staircases and doorways that lead you to different areas. As you climb, you may also notice that you can drop between floors to solve puzzles and find keys, the culmination of a concept introduced in the Fortress of Winds and built upon in the Temple of Droplets. You'll have to continue to clear gaps and memorize the rest of the dungeon before you can finally ascend to the top and fight the boss. You'll have to jump over projectiles, land on the blue Georg when the red one falls out of the sky, and dodge attacks while still creating clones of yourself that match the position of its eyes. An excellent way to cap off a brilliant and intricate dungeon. Even though the Palace of Winds is the last major dungeon, the Roc's Cape does get some use outside of it. Usually this means jumping between islands to find goodies, but there's one heart piece in particular that exemplifies Minish Cap consistently having players look at the world from a creative lens. You see this bell in Hyrule Town? You'll no doubt walk under it countless times throughout your adventure. With everything that the Minish Cap has taught you, you could potentially get the idea to ring it by jumping with Roc's Cape. Sure enough, you can ring it and a heart piece will fall out. Like the many uses of shrinking down, the Cane of Pachi, the clever use of bombs, the mole mitts, and many other elements preceding this heart piece, the world around you constantly changes and evolves as you learn to see things from various different points of view. And that's what I love most about this game. To further illustrate my point, let's take a look at the central hub, Hyrule Town. As you progress through the game, Hyrule Town continues to expand. New shops open up, new quests become available, and you can spot new uses for your items all over the place. As I mentioned earlier, the Cane of Pachi allows you to flip over pots around Hyrule Town so that you can shrink down and enter houses and caves that are normally inaccessible. This also means you'll have to apply your knowledge of traversing the world at this size, as well as figure out how each house and section of the town connect when you can't cross water, stairs, and paved pathways. As you continue to complete dungeons, buildings like the library, the school, and the shoemaker's shop will open up to you. You can even help rent out houses to Din and Nehru. The way the town gradually expands make it one of the most compelling aspects of the game to revisit, as there's always something new to observe. You can reach new parts of the town in your tiny form as you obtain new items. Pieces of a larger puzzle slowly fall into place, until it all comes together. In order to get to the Temple of Droplets, you'll need to speak to Elder Library, who apparently has a clue on how to get in. Unfortunately, the books that are usually used to climb up to him have been checked out from the library, meaning you need to scour the town for clues and follow the breadcrumb trail to each book. At first glance, this might seem like a glorified fetch quest, but like everything else in the game, it is much more than it appears. For each of the 3 books, you'll need to think outside of the box based on the information you've been able to retrieve as the game progressed. That chimney you couldn't get into when exploring as Mini Link? That's the key to a book. Remember the mole mitts? After receiving a tip from Hyrule Town, you can use them to navigate to a remote location in Lake Hylia for another book. My favorite has to do with Mr. Left's house. He'll only let you in once you inform him of his overdue library book, but the path forward is obstructed as a bookshelf needs to be pushed just a smidge, and you're too big to squeeze in between them. If you take what you've learned from putting out the fire in the couple's chimney, you can put out the fire here and continue on through a daunting path while still being tiny. The Minish talk about this path being guarded by some ferocious beasts, and no Minish has ever come back alive. As it turns out, it's just a couple of cats, no big deal. If you brave the path and clear out the enemies in the cave, you earn the power bracelets, allowing you to slip through those bookcases and create a path. Then you ascend to the rafters and use your weight combined with a fellow Minish and a clone to bring it down to the floor. I have no idea why the book was in the rafters, but it makes for a fun puzzle. Quests that have you scour every inch of Hyrule Town from both angles truly bring the design and atmosphere of the Minish Cap to life. These little areas that you've been exploring suddenly have purpose, as your job as delivery boy rewards you with the flippers. These things open up so much across the overworld. No ocean is too vast. To give you some perspective, about 12 of the game's 44 heart pieces and one full heart container can be accessed with these things. They're powerful to say the least, and the perfect reward for getting through all of this stuff. There's a lot going on in Hyrule Town, and I can safely say it remains one of this game's strongest aspects. In order to get the Pegasus boots, you can follow a tip from a Minish to a potion mixer in Lake Hylia that has a mushroom pungent enough to wake the shoemaker. Later in the game, the school opens to visitors, and you can solve a puzzle there by shrinking down and exploring to net yourself another heart piece and some rupees. There are some facilities that open up as you progress through the game that contain their own minigames and methods of making rupees. You can continue to spend your hard-earned rupees on upgrades at the shop. And then there's the Cucco chasing minigame, which gradually introduces challenges in accordance with the items you obtain. But you can attempt each challenge whenever you like. At first you have a great deal of time to fetch a few Cuccos, but then you need to start optimizing your movement as best you can as the margin for error shrinks. These gold Cuccos will slip out of your grasp, and I found the best solution is to get into a rhythm of picking them up, throwing them, immediately rolling, and then picking them up again so that they never slip away from you. The Cuccos are spread thin across the town at one point, requiring you to have almost perfect movement with the Pegasus boots. Eventually you'll have to cross a river and throw Cuccos across without letting them drown. It's really difficult. But what I like about it is that you can work on it at your own pace. You'll get rupees every time you clear a challenge, and once all of them are clear, you'll earn a piece of heart. Hyrule Town is awesome. It not only serves as the perfect hub to experiment with your abilities from many different angles, but also introduces you to several concepts across the game, and encourages you to get out there and explore. Let's talk about the overworld now. Although it is smaller than most 2D Zelda games, it is absolutely brimming with things to discover. Whether you're shrinking down to find new routes, using dungeon items, or simply investigating things that don't seem quite right, you're bound to discover something new. There's Lon Lon Ranch, which has you shrinking down to obtain Talon's house key, which enables you to explore routes and puzzles in the region that were once previously inaccessible. Lake Hylia has heart pieces, caves, and potential for shrinking all over the place. Pretty much everything that I've mentioned already comes into play in the overworld somehow, and it makes for an intricately designed world that both complements the intelligent design of the main quest and rewards players for testing their own ability to deconstruct the world from different angles. My favorite things to collect in the overworld, aside from the obvious example of heart pieces, are the Tiger Scrolls, which are passed on to you by the various swordsmen around Hyrule. Not only do their caves sometimes contain heart pieces just for discovering them, but they also teach you new techniques that enhance combat. Along with the classics like the Sword Beam, Spin Attack, and Dash Attack, there's also the Peril Beam, which allows you to shoot a beam when you only have one heart left. The Roll Attack, which lets you thrust your sword forward out of a roll, and the Down Thrust, which is reminiscent of Zelda 2, except not quite as useful. For collecting all 7 Tiger Scrolls, you can learn the Great Spin Attack, and let's just say on a screen this small, it is devastating. But you can't spam it, because certain enemies will counter you, especially Darknuts. It's the perfect balance. Now, I adore the overworld of the Minish Cap. Between Hyrule Town and the various goodies you can find by just applying the strategies the game consistently conveys, it's easy to get sucked into it. However, with an overworld this small and with it being so densely populated with rewards, a small compromise had to be made. If everything was made accessible all at once, the overworld would have felt a bit overstuffed. As such, the game implements a system to gradually reveal new things around the world. Throughout your journey, you'll find yourself racking up kinstones by cutting grass and opening treasure chests. If you see an NPC with a thought bubble above their head, whether they be human, minish, or a domesticated animal, you can fuse kinstones with them. When you perform a kinstone fusion, all sorts of things can happen, and usually, you won't know what those things will be. A cave could open in a tree, or in the ground where a puddle of water used to be, or in a waterfall. Someone could be inspired to create something new, opening up a new questline. A chest could spawn somewhere in the overworld, a golden enemy could appear, a beanstalk could sprout. The overworld opens up even more than you could possibly imagine with kinstone fusions, and you can fuse with nearly every NPC in the game. Kinstone fusions are an extension of the whole game's focus. When a fusion reveals a secret staircase or a hidden cave, it is in line with the notion of seeing things from a different lens. Take the Tingle siblings, for example. That's right, not only is Tingle in this game, but so are his quote-unquote siblings, Ankle, Knuckle, and David Jr. You can find each of them in specific locations across the overworld, and when you complete a fusion with one of them, one of 4 sections of a cave in North Hyrule Field opens up to you, with each section containing their own reward and a switch. After fusing with all 4 of them and pressing all 4 switches, you'll be able to collect the magical boomerang, which is like the regular boomerang, except you can control it. This was a godsend during the Palace of Winds when I didn't want to waste my arrows on distant enemies. And it saw some use elsewhere too. In addition to the Tingle siblings, remember that quest that allows you to rent out a house to Din and Nehru? Well, if you fuse kinstones with Furore, that will get the questline moving. Once Din has moved in, she'll fill an empty bottle with her charm, which increases your attack power for a short time. If you fuse kinstones with Bellari, the Minish that gave you bombs in the first place, a chest will spawn in the Wind Ruins that contains a larger bomb bag. There are certain fusions with rhyme or reason to them, encouraging you to talk to as many people as you can find. It's also important to consider that the amount of people that you can fuse with will increase as you progress through the game, and certain NPCs have multiple fusions available, although you do kind of have to figure that out on your own. The list grows and evolves just like Hyrule Town does. It's easy to get sucked into the kinstone system, and the gradual progression in the amount of fusions you can create can turn it into an obsession. With all of that said, there is an element of randomness and unpredictability to the kinstones. And as we discussed in the Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks video, when you introduce luck into a series as rigid as Zelda, there are bound to be problematic side effects, even if the mechanic is well intended. Aside from the gold kinstone pieces, which are placed in set locations for the main quest, kinstones come in 3 colors: green, blue, and red, with green being the most common and red being the rarest. There are 3 types of green kinstone pieces, 2 types of blue kinstones, and 3 types of red ones. Fusing blue and red kinstones usually yield the best results, like caves, heart pieces, and more. While the color you find in a chest is set in stone, and you can buy kinstones from specific merchants, the actual piece you find will be random, and it is not unlikely to end up with an abundance of kinstone pieces you don't need while scouring for the ones you do. In order to complete as many fusions as possible, you will need to walk up to each NPC multiple times throughout the game just to see if they have something new for you, and you will have to search for pretty much every possible chest that could contain a kinstone, just so you can somewhat guarantee you have the right ones to fuse at any given time. And while the kinstones NPCs require are not random, it's impossible to know which ones they'll want from you. Like the rest of the game, I think there are multiple angles from which I can approach discussion of this mechanic. On my first playthrough of the Minish Cap, I was obsessed with kinstones. They made me seek out virtually everything in the overworld and delve deeply into pretty much all of this game's systems. I didn't pay any mind to the randomness at the time because I was opening every chest and finding every cave possible, and even now, I still don't think it compares to how messed up it is in the DS games. It also doesn't really impact a casual playthrough much, as you can still grab a handful of heart pieces and upgrades without interacting much with the system at all, or just enough to gain an impression of it. I even appreciate the routes you have to take to obtain the heart pieces from fusing. In total, 9 heart pieces in a full heart container can be found through Kinstone fusions. One of these is introduced through the hurdy-gurdy man who gives you the Kinstone bag to begin with, while the rest are up to you to find. Some of these simply come from the things we've already talked about, like coming back to an area you couldn't fully investigate previously, now that you have the means to do so, like shrinking down and navigating to a Minish house to fuse with them. There's a Minish fusion in the far east section of Lake Hylia that causes a beanstalk to sprout somewhere in that region, which got me to search the nearby caves with the mole mitts until I could finally locate it. These ones aren't so bad. It's when the fusions get needlessly obscure that I get frustrated. It goes from assessing the world with some lateral thinking to frustratingly combing the world for any remaining fusions. Because you can fuse with pretty much every NPC at some point, you might find yourself going back to areas you wouldn't even think to otherwise. Going back to the Minish village to fuse Kinstones after getting the flippers to open a secret path in Castor Wilds? A bit obscure, but still rewarding for players that thought about returning to the area. Still, I could understand why this would be a bit weird. It's when there are multiple fusions from one NPC in the final phase of the game where things get silly. There are 2 relatively obscure NPCs in the Minish village that require multiple fusions to get the rewards you want. Since their next fusion doesn't show up until you leave and re-enter their house, there is a good chance you'll completely miss the next fusion if you're unaware of this. Perhaps my biggest gripe with Kinstone fusions is when an NPC is deliberately obscure. With the exception of the effects that fusions create in Hyrule Town thanks to their abundance, if you see a potential fusion effect in the overworld, especially in the more complex locations like Lake Hylia, Vale Falls, or Castor Wilds, I feel you should be able to check the surrounding area for a fusion. They shouldn't be locked behind an NPC in a completely separate and unrelated portion of the world. I understand and appreciate how the Kinstones introduce yet another lens from which to view the overworld, but sometimes they go a little too far. Also, there's no way to keep track of who you fused with, like the Bomber's Notebook in Majora's Mask. You're expected to memorize a lot in this game, more than even a seasoned Zelda player like myself is comfortable with. For a game that thrives on communicating things to the player and how they can apply those things in various ways, this system can seem very haphazardly thrown together, and I don't blame you if you feel that way. Kinstones are definitely going to be a make-or-break element of the Minish Cap, and they will heavily influence your enjoyment depending on how you like to play Zelda. But with all this on the table, it's important to consider that the Minish Cap was designed with portability in mind. Players were meant to experience it in short bursts, and digest the world a little bit at a time. Maybe check for fusions, investigate some parts of the overworld, whatever you feel like doing at any given time. This also contextualizes the game's short length. Although it only contains 6 dungeons excluding the final trip through Dark Hyrule Castle, the shorter play sessions will make it feel just as long as other 2D Zelda games. Personally, I am still okay with the idea of Kinstones unlocking new things in the game world. Its cryptic fusions complicate the game's focus, while its strong fusions reinforce it. It's a mixed bag, and I can't help but wonder if they were an afterthought when building the game world. Perhaps their ambitions for the overworld were constrained by the memory of the Game Boy Advance, and they used Kinstones to fill gaps. At the same time, I still love the idea of seeking out hidden NPCs and creating fusions that lead to worthwhile rewards. As I've said, there are many ways to look at the implementation of Kinstones. The fusion mechanic, as with the rest of the game and discussion surrounding it, is about seeing different perspectives. And I mean, hey, they aren't nearly as bad as the figurine quest. The Wind Waker had this side quest where you could develop figurines of the characters you took pictographs of. Doing this was entirely irrelevant to the main quest, but it was nice to see models and descriptions of all the characters you'd encountered along your adventure. The figurines return in the Minish Cap, only the method in which you obtain them is one of the most mind-numbing things a Zelda game has ever implemented. It's a gachapon machine. Across the overworld you can find mysterious shells and chests and whatnot. These shells are not for upgrading your sword like Link's Awakening, oh no! You can spend them to have a chance at obtaining a figurine, and the more you put in, the more likely you are to get a new one. This wouldn't really be so bad if it was a completely optional minigame like the Wind Waker's figurines, but the final heart piece is locked behind obtaining 130 of these things. This means if you want all 20 heart containers, you'd better spend your precious time pouring shells into the gachapon machine and hoping you get a new figurine, as well as grinding for shells when you inevitably run out. Yeah, I never go for this heart piece anymore. It's probably my least favorite heart piece in a Zelda game, but that's just my perspective. I suppose you could argue that doing this gradually over the course of the game was part of that portable experience, but I don't think I had the patience even back then to grind out this one. On the bright side, this game has a very strong final dungeon and boss fight. It factors in the Four Sword in creative ways, features a slew of new monsters and challenges from across your adventure, and introduces some new puzzles for good measure. The level of difficulty both in throwing yourself at the castle's hurdles and the final boss both validate that healthy obsession I fostered with the overworld, and when a Zelda game can strike that balance, I'm a big fan. The final boss itself has 3 phases. The first has you using the Gust Jar to expose Vaati's weak points. It's a tense phase in its own right, but the next phase is pure adrenaline. You have to dodge its attacks and hazards while shooting its eyes to create an opening for your Four Sword. It's not exactly easy to set this up, but immensely satisfying as you continue to whittle its health down bit by bit. And then, just as you free Zelda from her stone prison, the game surprises you with a final phase. After you cycle through your items figuring out what to do, you'll realize that you can use the Cane of Pachi to flip his arms over as they come through the floor, and create a path for your miniature form. Keep this up until you can line up your Four Sword clones and deflect Vaati's attacks for a chance at his weak point. Eventually, he'll finally go down. A dynamic final boss that constantly keeps the player thinking about how they can fight back, and in that regard, a reflection of the game that built up to it. Overall, I felt the Minish Cap was excellent, even if I don't think aspects of it will be for everyone. Nor will it impress every die-hard Zelda fan. Ultimately, the focus on seeing things from a different angle is what the foundation of the series is built on. The Minish Cap might seem a bit plain in comparison. However, the game takes this interpretation of the spirit of Zelda and implements it into every facet of its design. Whether you're shrinking to explore a hidden path, fusing kinstones to reveal secret caves, or exploring a familiar location or fighting a familiar enemy at the size of an ant, the Minish Cap constantly transforms and evolves as you learn to tackle age-old problems from a new perspective. It pains me that this game is often overlooked. At the beginning of this video, I touched upon a few of the things that could have held it back upon release. With the Nintendo DS releasing worldwide around the same time, its release window was unfortunate, and likely prevented it from seeing larger sales numbers. With that said, the same thing happened with the Oracle games, which were released a few months before the Game Boy Advance hit store shelves, and they still sold remarkably well. Both the Oracle games and the Minish Cap were also backwards compatible when the next console came out too. So what happened? Well, the Nintendo DS also marked the beginning of a new line of consoles, and a new way for games to be experienced. Most people adopting the console were likely fixated on that, and didn't pay any mind to a Game Boy Advance Zelda game with a cartoonish art style. That's something I feel strongly about. While public opinion on the Wind Waker's art style was still mixed at the time and no doubt impacted sales of the Minish Cap, the art style was a deliberate decision, and it was crucial to the game world. The Minish Cap oozes this childlike wonder and charm that is reflected in the lighthearted, whimsical art style it takes on. You've no doubt been able to observe some examples of this as you shrink down and examine the world from that angle, but I think the heart of the game lies with the Minish. The basic premise of the Minish Cap revolves around the fabled Picori, later known to us as the Minish, who take pride in creating things for humans to enjoy, but prefer to do things in secret. You know those rupees that you find in tall grass? The Minish hid them there. They are prevalent in folklore around Hyrule, and it isn't until tragedy strikes the castle that the myth is confirmed by the king himself. The notion of them being some grand secret is compelling enough, but then you find yourself teaming up with Eslo and shrinking down to enter the Minish village. It's one thing to hear about them, but it's another to witness the lives they've led under your nose. Throughout the game, you can observe the ways the Minish have integrated into the human world without anyone ever noticing them. They live in places like the rafters of people's houses, where a piece of cheese and an apple or two can last a group of Minish for a long while. It's also cool to get a sense of scale just from looking at these things in the ground below. The Minish are also depicted doing nice things for the humans under their noses, just as we've heard. They can be observed making shoes as the shoemaker sleeps, which references the elves in the Shoemaker fairy tale. Many of this game's aspects feel like a fairy tale come to life, and as a kid playing this game for the first time, it leaves a strong impression. It made me wonder if perhaps there were little creatures living in my backyard and going about their business. You know, aside from the bugs. More than anything, I think the Minish Cap takes inspiration from an old folktale about the Koropokuru, which originates from the Ainu people. The Koropokuru lived under leaves just as the Minish do, and would leave gifts for the Ainu under the cover of night as they hated being seen. In the story, a young man waits where the gifts are usually delivered, and grabs the hand of one as it places the gift. It is appalled by the man's rudeness, and from there, the Koropokuru were never seen again, although remnants of their gifts can allegedly still be spotted across the land. Much like the Koropokuru, man, that is hard to say, the Minish don't like being seen, and opt to deliver their gifts in secret. The ceremonies that the people of Hyrule hold in the hopes of seeing them betray their one wish of not being seen, and the people of Hyrule often take their kindness for granted. This is directly reflected in the tale of Ezlo and Vaati. I always loved Vaati's human design. It seemed like such a fantastic parallel to Link's bright colors, and he fits right in with the art style established in the Wind Waker. When Vaati first appears, he's kind of an asshole. There's no way around it. He causes just enough damage to be seen as irredeemable, and you're off on your journey to save your friend Princess Zelda. Ezlo later explains that he isn't just a goofy-looking hat. He was once a great Minish sage, and Vaati was his apprentice. Ezlo created a hat that granted the wishes of its wearer for the humans, which is where the double meaning in the game's title comes from. Link can wear Ezlo as a hat to shrink down and meet the Minish, but the villain's reign came from a cap created by the Minish. I only just realized this as I'm writing this video. Anyway, Vaati uses Ezlo's gift for his own evil desires, and Ezlo says something that parallels both the Ainu story and Ganondorf's rise to power. Vaati became enchanted by the wickedness in the hearts of men. Although Ganondorf may have been painted as pure evil, the Wind Waker pulled back the curtain to reveal that he was still human, a man still clinging to the past as the future was confronting him. To me, this, and in turn Vaati, both parallel an inherent wickedness in humankind depicted in the Ainu story. The curiosity and self-serving desires that led to the disappearance of the Koropokuru. If we take kindness for granted, we may never fully appreciate it until it's gone. Although Ezlo and Vaati's relationship is never properly fleshed out, I think the story works wonders through its simplicity, whimsical setting, and subtext. Ezlo is a bit of a selfish goofball for most of the story, but like most endearing Zelda partners, I learned to love him by the end of the game, especially after learning of his ambitions for the humans. Through Link and Ezlo's journey into the world of the Minish and beyond, the Minish Cap conveys a tale of kindness. Above all else, the Minish perform selfless acts for the humans because it's what they enjoy doing. I feel the Minish represent the impact we can have on others if we follow in their tiny footsteps and do good for those around us without expecting anything in return. A little kindness can go a long way. The Minish Cap is a simple Zelda game, but sometimes that's all you really need. It can be difficult to continuously meet the unrealistic expectations of an audience spoiled by greatness. It was a simple, whimsical journey because that's exactly what it wanted to be. And in realizing that, I've learned to appreciate it a lot more. It's hard work making the kind of videos I've become known for. I'm almost always creatively spent for a while after finishing a project. It's been nice taking a break with something smaller. The Minish Cap, along with the DS Zelda games I covered a few months back, reminded me that the best experiences don't necessarily have to be these grandiose, life-changing events to leave an impact. It reminded me that you don't need to slave away and ensure that every single thing you put out is some kind of masterpiece. Doing so can create unrealistic expectations from both yourself and your audience. Sometimes, it's nice to take a breather and just do something fun. Even if it doesn't receive the recognition of past projects, it can still tell its own story. And that's why the Minish Cap is worth remembering. It may be simple, but it's a game I can guarantee I'll revisit for years to come, to remind myself of why I create things for others to enjoy. I've been Liam Triforce. Thanks for watching.